Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 1 of Lesson 29, where we are concluding a really week-long discussion on the representations of Augustus ever since he was Octavian, all the way to becoming Augustus. And we are picking up also on your readings from the Aeneid, and you might recall that one of the early things we established is that the 12 books of the epic parallel the two Homeric epics, the Greek ones. And so the first 6 books that we have been talking about so far were more the Odyssean part. These were the parts that had to do with sort of the wandering of the hero trying to reach, in this case, Italy, or in the case of Homer, Ithaca. So we concluded the last class with looking at Aeneas's trip to the underworld and noticed how, even though the underworld foreshadowed quite a bit of the greatness of Rome as it was to come, it also ended with a somewhat ambiguous suggestion that maybe all those visions of Rome's future greatness that Aeneas was told by his father Anchises may not have been true, right? Because he didn't leave through the right gate from the underworld. So today we are looking at the second part of the Aeneid, which is the warfare part. And we are going to look at a few episodes selectively to get a sense again of how Aeneas encounters Rome's future and the various ways in which this is represented. And I think that one of the aspects of Augustan role that's very important, even no matter whether you're a text-based historian, to understand, is visual culture. And in order to appreciate this, I would say that it's helpful for us to think about the fact that in ancient Rome, even very high estimates of literacy would put the capacity to read and write to maybe 25% of the population. So inevitably, visual representation has a very important role in delivering messages that might not be delivered by writing in itself. And so the first section that I selected that we will talk about in person in class, but that we are going to talk about just via this lecture today, is in fact a visual representation described in Book 8, the shield that Venus, his mother, had made for Aeneas by Vulcan, the god of fire. So in this section, we get a description of what is on the shield, right? And I'm giving you here some modern drawings. One is more schematic on the left, and one is more beautiful on the right that people have tried to create on the basis of this description. Obviously, this is not a real shield, but as you may recall, Augustus had his shield. This shield is a little different, but Augustus will be on it. So let's just see what it looks like. So on this shield, the god of fire, not unaware of the prophecies, not without knowledge of the ages to come, had fashioned the story of Italy and the triumphs of the Romans. On it were the whole line of future generations descended from Ascanius, that would be Aeneas' son, and the wars they fought in due order. So what we see here, that not dissimilar to what we have seen in the case of the underworld, there is a capacity to use prophecies or to foreshadow the future, even though Aeneas is way back in the past, about what is coming the Romans' way. And emphatically, these are triumphs, right? And so how far back does this go? He had fashioned the mother wolf lying in the green cave of Mars and twin boys around her teeth, playing as they hung there and sucked at her without fear while she bent back her smooth neck and licked them by turns and molded their limbs with her tongue, right? So this is obviously the wolf and the twins Romulus and Remus. Close by this, he had added Rome and the outrageous rape of the Sabine women in the midst of the audience at the circus when the great games were held. And then after this, the war with the Sabines and Romulus and all the fighting. So what's interesting about this is that it sort of gives us a vision of Roman history, and it goes back to the foundation of the city and makes Romulus a sort of key figure of that story, sort of re-emphasizing that connection. So if you're looking here on the left at this schematic drawing, so Romulus and Remus are very fundamental to this story. But as we get a detailed description, and I'm not going to read through every single section of this, but as we get the detailed description of the shield of Aeneas, we actually also see a key element on it, suggesting again that at the time of Aeneas, the divine world could already foresee what was coming, including the Battle of Actium. And it suggests a certain kind of fatedness, right? This was unavoidable. This was going to be so much so that it was on the shield of Aeneas, even though it hasn't even happened yet, and it won't happen for 1200 years. So let's just see this description spreading widely between these scenes. There ran the likeness of the sea, wrote in gold, but the water foamed with white waves, and around it a circle of dolphins, gleaming in silver, swept the seas with their tails and cut through the tide. In the middle, the brazen fleets, which fought the battle of Actium, were visible, and you could see the whole of Leucate seething with war's array and the waves ablaze with gold. On this side, Augustus Caesar was leading the Italians into battle with the senators and the people, the household gods of Troy and the great gods, as he stood on the lofty stern of his ship. His exultant brow shot forth a double flame, and his father's star appeared above his head, right? Let's just stop there for a second. So what we see here is that Augustus Caesar, Augustus himself, is shown as sort of this key figure. And what we see him is that he is leading the Italians, right? Suggesting that all of the Italians are on his side, which would be obviously a bit of a pushing the likely reality of the Battle of Actium. But also the household gods of Troy are on his side. So really the essence of Rome is on his side. And in addition, so he's looking almost like a god, and his father's star appeared above his head. And what this references is that supposedly when Julius Caesar was killed, there was a comet. And so the idea was that, you know, the fantasy was at least, is that he was becoming, Julius Caesar was becoming a god. But this sort of makes the connection that Augustus is on his way to becoming a god. In addition to Augustus, in a different part of the fleet was Agrippa, high towering too, as he led his fleet in battle array with the favor of the winds and the gods. His temples gleamed, beaked with the naval crown, a proud token of warfare. Okay, so that's the Augustan side. On this side was Antony with his barbarian wealth and different sorts of armor, returning triumphant from the nations of the dawn and the Indian Ocean, and bringing with him Egypt and the might of the East and furthest Bactra and the sin of it, his Egyptian wife, right? So on this depiction, essentially Virgil endorses the Augustan representation of the Battle of Actium as between a sort of Roman side, and an Eastern side. So Augustus being the true Roman, you know, with the household gods of Troy, and on the other side, Antony, who is of course as Roman as Augustus, is depicted as barbarian, as someone who is also a conqueror of the East, but then also married to Cleopatra, his Egyptian wife. And so all rush together, and there is a fight. They meet for the high sea. You would believe that the Cyclades had been torn up and were swimming on the sea, or that tall mountains were clashing with mountains. So vast were the towered ships in which the men moved to the fight, right? So we get this sort of very dramatic description. And it goes on. And at the end of that, we get the successful Augustus, described as Caesar here, but that's Caesar Augustus, riding into the walls of Rome in triple triumph for solemnizing his immortal vow to the gods of Italy to build 300 great temples throughout the city. So we get this sense of Augustus both being triumphant, but in addition to being triumphant, also very, very pious. And this is something we will see even more of as imperial representation continues, is that sort of the military success and the religious element will be more and more connected to each other. So we get the whole streets are echoing with joy, and even Apollo is mentioned as supporting him. So the idea here is that on this shield, we see the future of Rome's greatness, and that future ultimately ends, right? The place where it all sort of comes to full circle is the Battle of Actium and the triumph that follows it, right? That's where the story goes. That's what we have been waiting for. That's where almost like history ends. There is nothing more to talk about. This is what we have been waiting for. So in conclusion of the shield, such were the sights on the shield of Vulcan, the gift of his mother. And he, that would be Aeneas, wondered at them, and though he knew nothing of the events, he rejoiced at the pictures as he raised onto his shoulders the glory and the fate of his descendants, right? The idea is that, of course, Aeneas couldn't have possibly known all this, right? But this was the fated trip. This is why he had to leave Dido. This is why he was a refugee, is that this was the great future to come from all of that. So the shield is a beautiful visual representation, and it's very much described in visual details to suggest that essentially all of Roman history is one big arc that starts with Aeneas and ends with Augustus. And that's where the whole story, that's where it's going, that's where the whole connection is between the two. So this is obviously not the shield of that Augustus himself had that we looked at a number of times, but this is another shield that's even more prophetic in its vision for this connection. I'm going to stop here for now, and we will pick up the story as the fighting will actually begin in Italy.